I'm going to talk about all the things that I wish someone had told me when I started my podcast. One, let's get into why you start your podcast. I did it because I ran a business when I first started. I had an agency when I started my podcast, and I wanted to get more clients in the door. I worked with people of all ages, and I knew that my ideal client was probably going to listen to a podcast, and that would be the best way for me to show my results. So, one thing that I didn't know about a podcast is it's kind of blind. There's You're really talking into a void with a podcast, and you don't really see who's watching or who's listening until you get a client, especially if you're creating a podcast for your business with the sole purpose of creating more sales, right? So, when I launched my podcast, all I could see were the people that were watching my podcast and the people that were downloading my episodes. It's not like Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, where people can like your work, people can comment on your work, right? I am pretty much blind to the experience of what someone is going through when they look through my podcast. I can kind of see if people are binging episodes, if one episode is highly rated versus the other based on the downloads, but I'm not getting that feedback that you would get on a normal social media platform. So that's one. Like expect a lot of like white noise, right, with the podcast, because you're not going to be constantly getting feedback about how people feel about the episodes until you get a client and they're like, "Oh, I binged all your podcast episodes." Then you'll be like, "Okay, it's working." So that's one. So with podcasting, it is a long-term game, and it's something that you have to be prepared for. Two is you want to get more followers. This is something that I wish someone had told me when I started podcasting is the ratings are not important at all. I have paid for so many master classes, so many mentors, and this whole time I thought ratings were important to help you climb up the ranks in the podcast rankings on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. What I actually learned recently is the best way to climb up the charts as quickly as possible is actually get a large amount of people following you at once. So now what I do is anytime I'm at a conference or a party, I am constantly just going around the room, working my way and getting people to follow my podcast. And that alone has been able to help with the amount of downloads, the amount of people that are interested. My podcast is so specific because it highlights women of color in finance. So it's very shareable content because people are able to empathize or really resonate with some of the stories that are on my podcast. So it's easy for my friends or people I'm going to conferences to share that stuff. But really, you want to focus on getting as many eyeballs on it in a short amount of time. So think about when you, as a person, are in a large group of people, whether you're in a master class, whether you're going to like a conference, right? It's you as an individual with a large room of people. Can you start promoting your podcast there, right? So a lot of times people will drop their Instagram handle. Can you drop your podcast handle? That has what's worked for me really well. Three is that, like I said, ratings don't matter as much. I spent so much time kind of digging my way through ratings, getting my clients to rate, getting my followers to rate, and it did not end up making a difference. So, in terms of what to prioritize, you want to prioritize followers instead of ratings. Another thing is that you'll have to promote the podcast just as much as you promote anything else in your business. So for the podcast, you're going to have to promote to your email list if you have one. You're going to have to promote through whatever other social media platforms you have. And especially if you have guests, you want to have enough time to promote them. So you're going to create more content than you did before when you have a podcast. It's not like you can just put it out into Apple Podcasts or Spotify and just hope that it takes off. You actually have to do the work to promote it, just like any other product or service you have. The fifth thing I wish I knew is hire an editor versus doing it yourself. One of the best things I did for my podcast, it was to hire an editor right off the bat. An editor costs about $200 or $300 for the month. We release 2 episodes per month, and I've known a lot of different entrepreneurs and podcasters that are hiring editors for much less, that are hiring them from Fiverr or Upwork, and for like less than 30-minute episodes. So that was the fifth thing I wish I knew, is that it was going to increase my recurring expenses in the business because an editor is a retainer expense. You're going to keep needing an editor for as long as your podcast is alive. And hopefully you're able to stay consistent, because having an editor puts a timeline on you. I think a lot of podcasts stop, or like a lot of podcasters quit because they are not incentivized to keep producing. But when you have an editor demanding audio files from you, you're going to show up, you're going to send the audio files because you're already paying someone to do this work for you. And lastly, you want to have your first few episodes ready. I actually launched with a podcast specialist. So they set up everything, the SEO, where my podcast should live on Spotify, Apple. We actually host our podcast on Buzzsprout. And we had the first 3 episodes ready. We spent about 2 months preparing. So I spent the first month making sure all my interviews were done with my with my best clients. I brought them onto my podcast to help promote. And then I promoted a lot, like on my social media. I had launch materials going out every single day, a month before the podcast was released, to build up hype. And that actually led to an increase in sales because so many people were excited about this new thing I was doing. They were excited about the new branding I was doing for the podcast. And that just led to more eyeballs on me naturally. So you really want to think, how can I make the release of my podcast an event for everyone to be excited about? I was also hitting like another business anniversary the same month I released my podcast, so I made it into a whole celebration event. So you want to be strategic. Like, instead of releasing a podcast just because you feel like it, think about what is the intention that you're going to use it for. Like, do you want more sales? Do you want to add some credibility? I know people who have even created podcasts to help their applications, whether applying to grad school, or like it can even help with the job market if you're still a 9-to-5er. But really be clear about the intention of why you're creating a podcast. And those are the few things I wish I knew before I started one. It's a long-term game, it's a long-term project, and you have to keep promoting as you keep going.